coming up on Sleep, Eat, Perform, Repeat.
I then got offered this role at Richmond as a 24-year-old. And Richmond were on the bottom of the ladder and they were financially in a lot of trouble. And it was only about 10 years after they'd had their greatest ever generation. The mighty had fallen, really. And I remember ringing my dad up and I said to him, look, I don't think it's a very good job. And he said, if it was a very good job, they wouldn't be asking you. And he was so right. And it wasn't like a lack of belief in me, but it was basically saying that if it was a first choice job, there would have been plenty of other people before they take the 24-year-old. Hello, my name's Cameron Schwab. I'm from Australia. I spent a lifetime in the great game of Australian football. This is my episode on Sleep, Eat, Perform, Repeat. And I've gone pretty deep in this episode, so I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Sleep, Eat, Perform, Repeat with your hosts, David Clancy and Ciarán Dunn. This is a podcast about high performance. What we are striving to achieve is to figure out what makes high-performing individuals tick, why they do what they do, and why they are successful. Enjoy a journey of stories, lessons, and learnings.
Today we spoke with Cameron Schwab, CEO for 25 years in the AFL, leadership mentor and founder of designCEO. Cameron had the most impressive studio we've seen, a fireplace, AFL memorabilia and a classy ambience. It really gave an inside peek into the world of Cameron, class and quality personified. Cameron, an artist, storyteller and writer, has been a CEO for 25 years, with experience with Melbourne Football Club, Richmond and Fremantle Dockers, as well as also leading the AFL as CEO. His company, designCEO, a leadership and strategy business, focuses on helping leaders navigate the hardships and ambiguity of modern leadership. Cameron, a graduate of Harvard Business School, today spoke about being a leader rather than doing. What it was like holding the role of CEO at the age of 24, the youngest to hold this position in AFL history. He proclaims to never forget how hard it is, the travails of a leader. And Cameron opened up for us, displaying remarkable vulnerability, unpacking the lessons of being a father to a trans child, broken families, and having had mental health challenges himself. He spoke about how hard some things are and how the hard moments define us. His leadership equation, what he looks for in people, aptitude, and why being in your element is massively important. Cameron Schwab, thank you very much for spending some time with us today. Really looking forward to having a conversation with you. We'd like to nearly start with the words we read about never forgetting how hard it is. And it resonated a lot with the two of us there when we were looking up your bio and your background and the work you've done. How hard has your journey been to now?
I think all of our journeys feel hard when you're experiencing them. You know, if you wake up in the morning and your first thought's fuck, I think that generally means it's pretty hard. Is that okay? I don't think you've actually led unless you've had that experience. You know, really, if nothing else, leadership is most required when things are complex, ambiguous, when there's conflict involved. If not for those times, we probably don't need leadership because in the end, we sort it out via consensus or some other means, or the answer is obvious enough for us to take whatever steps it is to find it. Really, you know, I often say it's the hard days that define you because they're the days that your leadership's going to be tested, but you're also going to unveil parts of yourself which you mightn't have even known that you had, but the situation's going to then demand them of you. And I think that's the same in my role was as a CEO in elite sport in the Australian Football League, which I got to do for a long time. But I think of that as much as a parent as well. You know, I've got a transgender daughter, so that even, you know, from that perspective, recognising or waking up and knowing that you're not sure how to parent your child anymore, they're all parts of that notion of they're the hard days. And generally they're the days also you make yourself, for whatever reason, whatever process you put yourself through, that you make yourself more accessible to the learning that your situation may require of you as well. I think I think it's something about that. You find out more about you. You find out more about those around you. You find out who's with you, who's against you. All those sorts of things are the hard days. And I got sacked a couple of times for my roles. And I think, as much as I like to think about the positive parts of my career, then no doubt they were the days where I probably wasn't the person I thought I was. And I defined myself by what I did rather than who I was in many ways. So I had to find out a little bit more about myself in that sense.
We really enjoyed, and we'd love you to share, if possible, the metaphor you use for leadership about a swan. And also, where did that come from? Where did the origins of that?
Well, it came from a man who's pretty familiar to your part of the world. He's actually a Yorkshireman, but he spent a lot of time in Ireland. His name's David Whyte, and W.H. Whyte. He's a beautiful writer, and he's a poet, and but he actually does a lot of work in corporate areas. And he by training he was actually an oceanographer. He tells a story how he grew up with looking at his black and white television, and Jacques Cousteau's boat sailed across his black and white screen, and he decided that's what he wanted to be in life, and he got to do that, sail the Galapagos and dive the Galapagos and all that type of thing. And I related to that because I remember seeing a black and white image of Australian football on our little television at home with the rabbit ears, and you had to try and tune it in to whatever station you could actually get just to watch the game. And decided that that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to somehow in life be someone who could live that part. And so I related to that story when I heard it. And then he uses the metaphor of the swan as in when you see the swan on the water or you see the swan in the air, the swan looks beautiful. It looks stunning. It's a magnificent bird. That's when it's in its element. But when it's on land and when it looks awkward, it looks angry, it looks aggressive, and it's almost like it's got its legs tied together. Well, that's where it spends most of its life. It's spending most of its life in a place where it looks like it's in struggle, if you like. But when we get to, we see the glory of it when it's on the air and in the water, and that's when it's in its element. And from time to time, we're going to all find our element, whatever that might be. But we're going to spend a lot of time not in our element. And it's really the struggle, if you like, where the learning happens, which then gives you the beauty and the experience of those often very fleeting moments where, and often they're only moments known to you, and I can remember almost an observer in my own world where something would be happening in the club or something would be happening around you where you go, I know that I played a very big role in this, but only you know the role that you actually played in it. And to actually to beat your chest or to say, hang on a second, this is all because of me, is clearly not what that situation requires of you. And it can be, you're almost driving home knowing that you're the person, but no one knows you're the person. That's often what it felt like. But they were the days when you're in your element, and they felt wonderful.
Building onto a quote that we've taken from your book of David Whyte, when your eyes are tired, the world looks tired also. And you've touched on you're in your element, why you're doing what you do. You were a chief exec at the age of 24 years of age. Okay, so pretty young, right? Not many have that role at that age. How did you know you were in your element then?
Well, I probably didn't. The interesting thing about that is at 24, you're still working yourself out very much. And I was that. I grew up in an environment where I was around the game a lot. So my father was a very high-profile person in the sport. So there's no doubt that gave me some advantage, both in a nurture sense, as in the stuff I grew up with, but also my profile was probably as the son of a well-known person. It was enhanced by that as well. And so there was a wonderful show every Sunday, and I think most countries have a version of this, but it was just called World of Sport on a Sunday afternoon. And there was a wonderful Australian footballer by the name of Kevin Sheedy who played for the club that I supported, Richmond. And he then went on and coached Essendon, another famous club here, and he coached them for 27 years in a row, which is an extraordinary thing. And he coached them to 4 premierships, 4 championships during that period. And they were generally thereabouts for much of that 27 years. But he was still playing at this stage, and he was on the program, and he spoke in a way which was different to even players mainly spoke in that era. And I remember the commentators at that time said, "Oh, Kevin Sheedy is a student of the game. He's a student of the game." And I really didn't know what that meant. I was only about 10 or 11 myself, but I thought that's what I want to be. I want to be a student of the game. I had really no concept that it would take me into a career in the sport. But I thought if there's a thing I want to be a student of, it's a student of the game of Australian football, because I just had I fell in love with the game before I fell in love with anything else in my life. Maybe Batman probably was just the only other thing at the time. And so that was really, and then I had access to the people who were the game of that era, including my father, and he was running the Richmond Football Club at that time, and there's a famous coach who would come around by the name of Tom Hafey, and he'd come around to our house and they'd talk about the game, and I'd be watching the game. I'd be listening to them speak, and they'd be talking about the game, but not like they did on World of Sport, because they'd be talking about the game as in who failed, who played poorly, who needs to improve, who won't make it, who will make it, all of those sorts of things. And I'm hanging off every single word, not saying anything. So even though I was 24, probably my access and my understanding of the sport was no doubt enhanced by that circumstance. But I was 24 in all the other ways that you are 24. But, I really hadn't in any way decided or defined or understood myself well enough to realise how I wanted to lead. So I almost became some sort of Frankenstein monster of all the other versions of leaders that I'd come across at my time. And it took me a long while for the penny to drop to actually work out that to lead with any, and the term is authenticity, but that certainly wasn't used at that time. But to lead in any way which is even at least consistent, is I had to learn to lead in a way which is a reflection of who I was. And I got to learn those lessons relatively early in the piece, because I struggled. And the interesting thing was, people will always ask you, were you ready? Were you ready for it? Well, the answer clearly is that I wasn't. As I've gone through life, I've worked out that you're never ready. You're never ready for whatever. And my father at the time then worked at the Australian Football League. So he went from a club-based administrator into the competition-based administrator, and he was very influential. I then got offered this role at Richmond, and as a 24-year-old, and Richmond were on the bottom of the ladder, and they were financially in a lot of trouble. And it was only about 10 years after they'd had their greatest ever generation. The mighty had fallen, really. And I remember ringing my dad up, and I said to him, "Look, I don't think it's a very good job." And he said, "If it was a very good job, they wouldn't be asking you." He said that was his response, And he was so right. And it wasn't like a lack of belief in me, but it was basically saying that if it was a first choice job, there would have been plenty of other people before they take the 24-year-old guy. But that's often where the opportunity then sits. Like most coaching jobs, for instance, they're not very good jobs. They've become available because something's happened, someone's failed, the system's failed, the person's failed. And one of the important reflections coming into those sorts of roles where there has been failure is to try and establish why it's actually failed. Was the person who'd been before you, were they so poor that they'd lost their job, or was it something else going on in that organisation? Because you are going to walk into that same thing in most cases. And I was probably so naive to all of that at the time that it didn't really worry me. But I found out quickly. I worked it out quickly. And even though I knew that I was underdone, and there were certainly days where I wasn't prepared for what was coming my way, because I had no reason to be prepared, because I was young. I never doubted that I wasn't the right person for the role. And I hope that doesn't sound arrogant, but I just always felt that I was still the best person for the job. And I managed to do it for 6 or 7 years. And we turned it around. We didn't win a premiership, but we were able to at least be competitive, and the business model changed, and it was an unbelievable lesson in life. So I basically had my life job, because I grew up as a Richmond supporter. I was then the CEO of that club at 24. And then by the time I'm 30, I'm looking for whatever's next. So I had my life job really early in the piece.
I'm just thinking too, we're kind of looking back in hindsight at the role for 6 years, and sometimes things can become a little bit blurred. When we're looking into the day to day, them hard moments where you wake up and you say, fuck, I don't know what I'm doing here. This is difficult. If it's a case of I'm struggling with that in my mind, a younger Cameron, what was your approach to finding the courage on them days to go into the club and show leadership, or to take on the hard tasks that you maybe might be doubting yourself on a smaller basis in the micro?
Yeah, so I think you're in doubt most of the time. That would be so leadership in many ways. It's not what's happening inside you. It's not what's happening around you. It's how you show up. So you better become very good at what's happening inside you. You better be very good at dealing with what's happening around you, because people expect you to show up, and not show up as, probably my inclination was to get on my metaphoric white horse and come in as the person with all the answers. But clearly, as a young CEO, you don't have the answers. And even as, so my first response was that, and I think it was out of fear a little bit. I had this embedded fear that people wouldn't see me as being tough enough, because I was young and I looked young as well. I was actually a late developer in life. I was, I look at the photos of me as the CEO and I look like I'm in a boy band. I've been like in a new romantics boy band or something like that at the time. I didn't puberty till I was about 16 or 17. I was a late developer, and so I'm a gawky Poindexter kid, really, in lots of ways. But I sort of, and I didn't really feel that, but I look at it now. So part of me was actually saying, well, I have to be seen as having the answers, but clearly I didn't have the answers. My role as a leader is to actually, to develop or create an environment. And there's generally, in my experience, sort of three scenarios that we have to deal with. The first one is, are we just, if we, as a CEO, are you just passing over information? Are you just explaining something? And a fair bit of it is that. This is what explaining what we're doing, because you're not expecting anyone to, you're not wanting or expecting any feedback on those sorts of issues. Then you've got the second dimension, which is the more creative, innovative. What's the strategy going to look like? What's the plan going to look like? What's the way forward here? How do we build the team? That's a much more, that's a different environment that you're seeking to create in those moments. But I found 1 and 2 to be relatively okay, because I was naturally okay at some of the communication side of it. I found that relatively easy. The third one was the hard one, is that's when you're dealing with tough decisions and conflict, and people are turning on each other and they're turning on you. And as the CEO, you're often the last to know in those situations, because no one tells their CEO their baby's ugly. It's just one of those, getting honesty is really hard. And I look at those moments and think they're the ones where I let my ego kick in. I got angry. I probably was hyper competitive because I thought that's how you had to be. I wasn't as brave as I should have been. And I wasn't as kind as I should have been in some way. And I think you almost got to go through those things to recognise this thing's going to draw on parts of you which you won't necessarily reflect positively on. But you almost have to go through that thing to understand that. And that's what it did, really.
Having gone through it, you then came up with your understanding as to what leadership is. And you kind of even had a formula for it in and around bringing in some of those words you're touching on, like emotional intelligence. Would you nearly unpack, we obviously understand what it is, but maybe for the people that don't, are listening, how you came to shaping that formula and kind of why you felt those ingredients in it are so important for you?
Yeah, there's a term which James Clear's talked about this in his book Atomic Habits, that is that we don't rise to the level of our goals or our ambition, we fall to the level of our system. I look at most environments, but particularly sport, as being a mix of mechanics and dynamics. What are the mechanics that we need to get right, the systems that we need to get right here? And then the dynamics is then the interrelationships and how people work well together. And even when it comes to conflict, and my experience also is that even the strongest cultures, there's a lot of conflict embedded in. In fact, they become very good at conflict. That's actually part of it. And one of the reasons they do that is that they make it task conflict, not relationship conflict. We don't allow task conflict to play into relationship conflict. So even that process of being quite systematic started to play out for me. So even regularly, and if I was to coach one thing as a leader, it would be as simple as all of this. And very few people do it. So this is almost like the secret sauce of, this is the thing that took me 30 years to work out. And I now teach it. So I teach the system that I wished I'd had when I was going through it, but I had to go through that system to have it. So it always builds off questions, and questions regularly asking yourself. And the questions you ask yourself is basically to establish a practice of reflection for yourself. And it can be simple. I've got 3 questions I think you should ask all the time. The first one is, what does this role expect of me? Like, as it sits now. So even as you guys sit there, what does this role expect of you? You know, even when it comes to your preparation, you know, when it comes to who does what at this time, okay, how do you present with humility? How do you present with decency? How do you actually be responsible? Whatever the thing will actually ask of you at those times. And so I'd say I'd set myself 3 hours every 3 months to answer that question. Because it changed. Every 3 months or so seems to be a period enough for it to change, because the role is different in 3 months' time, because the future's unknowable. One thing we've learned through COVID is just how unknowable our future actually is. So what does this role expect of me? And then the second question is, what do I expect of the role? And I wasn't very good at that. And so the question you asked before about my capacity to respond to situations, it was normally just try harder, work harder, do more. Well, the one thing I worked out is do more is just a really, that is just a recipe for disaster. But you can do different. So it's not about doing more, it's about doing different. Whereas my response wasn't to do different, it was to do more. And that came at a personal cost, you know, as in I was probably, when I was fatiguing myself, and coming back to the David Whyte idea of if your eyes, I didn't want to answer that, if your eyes are tired, well, that's what you're doing. You're just fatiguing yourself out. And that's just not bad for you, that's bad for everyone else. That's bad for everyone else. So what do I expect of the role? And I wasn't demanding enough of the organisation as it related to me, because it needs to work both ways. And so if the role is costing you your mental health, well, that's up to you to work that through. And hopefully you're in an organisation which is responsive and empathetic to that. But I've got to say that wasn't happening much in the 1990s and 2000s. There wasn't a lot of empathy for those things. Because the third question you ask yourself is, what do I expect of myself? Well, you expect of yourself to actually survive this thing in a positive way. And I say that in all bluntness because I got diagnosed with clinical depression when I was in my 30s. And it's probably hardly surprising given what I'd put myself through at that time. But I kept it as my secret for the next 20 years. I didn't tell anyone. The only person who knew was my wife. And I was in like a process of therapy and all that for the best part of it. No one talked about depression in those days. And so if I answer those questions, if I was good at answering those 3 questions, I would have probably done some things differently to not allow myself to get into those spaces. So the 3 questions are simply, what do I expect of the role? What does the role expect of me? What do I expect of the role? What do I expect of myself? And that's a systematic process. But what it's actually doing, it's embedding a practice of reflection in your life. And then when it came into even the more, say I was in a situation of conflict or I was dealing with a difficult issue, I would then actually take the time. I'd just say, I'd write down, and people didn't know what you were writing down. They thought you just notes in a meeting. I go, what does this situation expect of me? And then I'd write down 4 words: calm, brave, humble, kind. Calm, brave, humble, kind. So what would a humble leader do now? What would a kind leader do now? What would a brave leader do now? What would a calm leader do now? And people think you're just writing notes, but you just actually, all you're doing is you're giving yourself the space and the pause, like any form of elite sport. The great athletes pause, don't they? They've got that moment to actually just stop for a second. In our game, it's when a player's having a shot for goal. You can see when a penalty kick in soccer, that capacity to pause is one of the most powerful things. Well, we have to learn to do that in conflict situations. Even when you're having an argument with your partner or something like that, sometimes you just go, "Oh, yeah, you don't need to. This is crazy shit." We should let's just stop for a second. Let's just take a break. No, this is not enough to get ourselves into this place. Well, the same thing applies, I think, in the leadership role. If you can't pause, if you can't answer those questions, well, the chances are you're almost dishonouring the role, I reckon.
Thinking about that creation of the ability to be able to pause and to respond appropriately or effectively, or even as you would like. You mentioned before, I think, that journaling became a tool that you could use to better understand yourself and maybe to better respond with them moments of adversity or difficult challenges you face. What's your process for journaling? Why has it been so important to you?
I think the main thing is it is a structured practice of reflection, and you can make it as structured as you like. You know, for some people, it's just stream of conscious writing. For some people, it's idea development. For some people, it's answering questions. Some people, it's gratitude. You know, some people, it's empathy. I think there's different. I've tried all different versions. I've actually got one at the moment I'm using, which is called the Daily Stoic.
Yeah. Ryan, yeah.
So I'm working my way there, and I can't say I've done everyone, but I've probably done 2 out of 3, and they are interesting questions. And so it becomes for me I do have a practice of meditation as well. One of the most important things that leaders have to do, but I think anyone has to do in many ways, is we have to be good at making sense of things. How do you become a great sense maker? You know, particularly when there's confusion around you and you're confused yourself. And by writing, I find it's a capacity to often connect disparate pieces of thinking that are sort of running around in your head somewhere. The minute you go to write it, you go, often I say, no, I've been here before. It feels like a different situation, but it's not as different as what I'm making it out. You know, it's you know, I have been in a situation where I've had to deal with an angry or a highly political situation. I found them the most difficult circumstances where it wasn't merit-based anymore. Does that make sense? It was more about people wanting to hold power over you rather than do things which we agree are in the best interest of the organisation. One of the most challenging issues that I found over time was when you realise the enemy is wearing the same colours as you are, and you know, where it's someone inside your own organisation. That's not unusual, by the way, because not necessarily because people are bad people, they just don't agree with how you're going about it, and they know the only way of getting their way is to undermine your way. And there's a lot of selfishness in that, but that's just human nature coming into play. And so the journaling for me would be building clarity around thinking. So even in if I've got an important meeting, if I just turn up to that meeting thinking I can wing it, where I haven't actually, almost no different to a player turning up at a game and they haven't visualised, if you like. So I'm basically visualising the meeting. I would, even in that situation as journaling, I'd say, well, the seat I try and picture the seat I'm going to be sitting in, the room, most of the time you've been in the room before, the room I'm going to be in, the personalities of the people in the room, how they're likely to respond. And almost inevitably out of the journaling process, I'd make up my mind to almost say nothing for long periods of time, because I've made up my mind already what I think the critical issues we need to sort out are. Whereas if I go into the room underprepared for that, I'm talking the whole time because I'm trying to work stuff out, and that's rarely going to create the scenario. So journaling has a practical application there. I found it very important from dealing with the depression. That was a critical part, because I'd often write down, I'm thinking this way, but I know this is my depression talking. It's not me talking. And that almost created a second personality. It almost externalised the mood. I always have music playing. I always have like headphones music. I've got a playlist called Mood Changes When I'm Feeling Fucked. And so it's just music which I know makes me feel better. So it's all those things just to put yourself into a good, healthy place. And it just seems to me that if you spend 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, I try to do at least 30. It's no doubt, it's no different going I'm a cyclist, going for a ride in the morning, doing some journaling. You've sort of half won the day already in some ways. You know, you've got using it from a cricket person, you've got runs on the board already. That's the journaling, I think, can be whatever you need it to be. So I practice a little. I do like to ask myself questions and answer questions. And they've got to be what questions or how questions. Like, what is this situation? How will we know? How do I make it happen?
Yeah, I love that. Very helpful. Thanks.
Just like to dig into the recruitment piece for a minute, Cameron. And you had mentioned how aptitude for you is really, really important. Yeah. What are you teaching yourself now? What's the big thing that's sparking your curiosity or you're digging into?
It's a funny thing that, and this was only a recent revelation for me, is that most people in life have some sort of to-do list. Do you guys have like a to-do list
Yeah.
You have started with some sort of to-do? How often have you done something which isn't on your to-do list, then put it on your to-do list and ticked it off?
Rarely.
I've got to admit it.
No, I think because the sense of progress is important. So most people have some form of to-do list, if you like. I'd say, okay, well, what's your to-do list? What's its context?
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to think its context is something bigger, like a to-be list, if you like. What do you want to be? Your to-do and your to-be. Okay, the power list. Yeah, okay, cool. So what's actually in the power list?
Shout to Andy Frazella. It's 5 critical tasks to make he would say you've won the day. So for me, it's the things that really move the needle, and it can be professional or personal. So it could be for family as well, or even for myself, like if I was cycling, as an example. So 5 things, and there's a journaling piece as well, and the book I'm reading.
All right, cool. Well, that's
every day. That's what I do. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's taking the to-do list into a deeper place. So, because if a lot of people, their to-do list is almost their inbox, which is really just your to-do list is now being defined by people who just happen to have your email address in many ways. And because there's the act of getting it done, there's no doubt there's some sort of dopamine hit, or I'm not sure what the chemistry is. So one of the things which I start to say, what is your to-be list? Which is probably more what you're saying there. I want to be this. I want to be a fitter person. I want to be I've got sort of 5 domains. I want to do good work. I want to enjoy and look after myself. I want to be present with my family and friends. I want a creative space. How do I create a space? And I want to stay organised. They're my sort of 5 domains, if you like. So they become a bit of a context even from a journaling point of view and intentions with it. So what I think links your to-do list and your to-be list is what I call your to-know list. Your to-know list, which is your learning list. So what do I want to learn about? And I found that my to-know list hasn't changed since I wanted to be a student of the game. It hasn't changed at all. I still want to go deep into, like at the moment, it originally was just the game itself. How do you become good at the game? But there's a finite aspect to that. Unless you're coaching the team, you can go as far as you want to go in terms of that stuff. But then it became more about performance, and then the role of leadership as it relates to performance, because I don't think you can ever outperform your leadership. I don't think that's possible. So my to-know list, as in the stuff I love reading about and speaking about and sorting myself through, hasn't changed, even though my expression of that has. My expression of it was previously as a CEO of AFL clubs, which I got to do for 25 years. Whereas now I teach leadership to CEOs and their teams. So it's a different form of that. But the stuff which still drives me is still the same. And so when I talk to aptitude, I talk about mindset, about your ability to teach yourself things, your growth mindset. So even as part of all of this, I've had to work out how I now express my to-know list in a way where I can make a living from it. So I've created a business design CEO. I'd never had to do that before, I went back to art school. I studied fine art in my 50s. So I went to art school and I taught myself things as part of that. I had a conversation with someone once who, when I asked, because the first question I ask in job interviews is, have you ever taught yourself anything? Have you ever taught yourself anything? Almost the same question as you just asked them there. Have you ever taught yourself anything? And someone I knew taught themselves how to make guitars, as in electric guitar, on YouTube. And they said, actually, I made a guitar out of our old family. I inherited when my parents passed away, I'm an only child, I inherited our family home. It was just a little suburban home. And we decided to rebuild on the block. But I made a guitar out of the wood from our family home,
Wow.
And this, you can imagine, this is a great story, Isn't that a good story? And And so, and he brought his guitar. It looked like a Bruce Springsteen butter blonde Telecaster. He made it all like that, but the wood was quite rough on it. And I said, "Oh, yeah, it's a bit," and I said, he could tell I thought it was a bit rough. He said, "I deliberately kept it rough because I know I could have easily sanded it back, but it wouldn't have been our house if I'd done it that way because it was a rough house, you know." Isn't that a cool story? So you actually start to hear things from people, and their eyes light up when they tell the story. So an example being having a transgender child. I didn't know how to parent my kid anymore. So I went deep into all of that. I now actually get asked to speak at Pride events, and they've got I was at an event only a few weeks ago where they raised the rainbow flag at a football club in Dalesford. The area I'm from has a very strong LGBTQI community. That's part of its heritage. Originally, is a bit of a place where people escaped, but it's really embraced that part of its heritage. And they were raising a flag at the game, and it was this beautiful speech and ceremony as a game of football was happening behind me, with all the classic football sounds, macca, 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 kick it, all the swearing, and black. It was just basic country football, and you could hear the wheezing and the leather of the ball on all those classic football sounds could be any ground in the whole of Australia. So I've got my two worlds have come together here, the raising of the flag and the footy game in the background. Well, they're two worlds which no one would ever have believed would have come together when I grew up, And so my learning is now, how do I parent my child, And because our goal is to build a child for the path, not a path for the child, because she's going a different path than I'd ever dreamed that she was going to go down. And so how do I be a good dad, in this situation, Whereas all my dreams growing up, my thoughts growing up was, I've got a boy who play footy and I'll go and watch him play, I'll coach his team, none of that happened. None of that happened. And at 17, she made the choice. She was Lockie and she's now Evie, So these are all the things you then teach yourself. And you probably even my voice will change. You notice how people change when they're talking about something that has been so important to them. And that's that idea of aptitude. Have you ever taught yourself anything? And you get some great responses.
Cameron, my last one, and then I'll kick it to Kieran. Frank Miller, does he have a rival? Because you've mentioned Batman, and you're quite an illustrator, and you went back to art school. And for people that just check out your work, Cameron, you mentioned the creative space as well, and obviously the storytelling that's coming through today. What is it about the drawing? Because those illustrations are really cool, and obviously they complement your writing and probably when you're talking. What is it about that you're enjoying?
When I was a young fella, grandfather, my mum's dad, who we called Puppy, taught me how to draw. It was on butcher paper, the big sheets of butcher paper. I don't know if you can remember those. They used to wrap your stuff up, and probably don't use it anymore. But then, he was a tradie, so he had the big fat tradesman pencils, they used to draw. And taught me how to draw horses, and because I was obsessed with Batman and Superman, and I was more a DC person than a Marvel person.
Good man.
DC,
yeah, DC here as well. Good man.
Forget Marvel.
We're a rare breed.
We are. They were big in the day. So, but it was Batman really, and notice my drawing's fairly comic-like, and so it's very much in. And then I started drawing footballers, and so I was probably the first thing. And you get positive reinforcement when you're growing up. When I was a kid and I could draw okay, you got known as the kid who can draw a bit. So you're almost encouraged in some ways. And so when I was going through school, there was a thought that I might, probably a strong thought, at least for a period of my life, I'd study fine art. And that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because I actually didn't do well in year 12 in art. I had a tough couple of years. My parents got divorced when I was in my final couple of years at school, and I just lost my way, and it was just a pretty traumatic period. And so I didn't do as well as I thought I would do. And then just an opportunity opened up. It was actually the Melbourne Football Club who invented the game of Australian football, actually in 1858. So it's a wonderful old footy club. They just won the premiership, their first in 57 years last year. And it was a wonderful opportunity. I was only 18. So I did that, and then my career emerged, and 6 years later I was a CEO. So that's how it played out. So the drawing for me, it's never been an escape. People often ask that because I do put a bit of expectation on myself. It's not I'm doing it with the view that I want to do it in a way which is an expression. So there's two forms of art that I go. One is almost an illustrative part of it, where I see an image and I just want to do my interpretation of that image. And then there's other drawings which there's a story in it in some shape or form, but the story is not my story. The story is for whoever is looking at the artwork to create their own story from, and studying fine art was interesting because I had a lecturer who came to me at one stage, because I was I'm studying first year uni and I'm 50. And that was after I left as a CEO. So I'd done 25 years of CEO, and then I studied fine art, which is a big step, I've got to say, at the time. And I'm a little closer. But I'm almost like a tribal elder with all these young people. They're mainly kids straight out of school. And there's first year university students, and then there's first year fine art university students. There's another dimension again, in terms of craziness. So I got on really well with the lecturers. And one of the lecturers came to me about halfway through my first year. He said, "You do art like a CEO. You do art it's like the ultimate put down for an artist." And my realization was that I didn't have enough courage in my art to allow the viewer to make up their own mind. That I was doing art which was so obvious that it was boring, it was uninteresting. And so I have to be in a different space to create that form of art, if you like, because there's normally something deeply embedded coming out from me, and it might be, my the very thing I just spoke about, that at 16 or 17, seeing your parents who you just assumed would love each other all their life actually hate each other. That's actually not an easy thing, a pubescent child to go through in its own way. And my father was my hero, as you can probably sense, but also really close to my mum. So two people who loved us dearly but actually stopped loving each other is one of those challenges. So sometimes I'll try and reflect that, and often it is storytelling. I do like going deep into, and all stories ever are your interpretation of what happened. They're not real. They're just how you lived it and how you remembered it as. And so even if I talk about that period of my life, whether it's through my art or through my writing, I've got an older sister, and she's 3 years older than me. So if she's a 13-year-old girl, I'm a 10-year-old boy. Well, they're very different recollections, And I'll go, "This is what happened." She goes, "No, it wasn't like that at all." It's her memory, but it doesn't matter. It's what it's left you with. And so art for me is sometimes just a fun interpretation of an image that I just like, or I love, or my interpretation of it. But the stuff I care about, I know it's going to suck the goodness out of me when I'm doing it. I know that. And the same with some of the deeper writing. I can be writing and crying at the same time. And as I feel spaces, my dad died young, and he got drunk one night, and he got drugged by a prostitute, and he died. And there's not one part of me which doesn't think about that a lot. Not the way he died, but the fact he died, because we still have 30 years of talking to do. So I've created situations where we're having one more conversation, or where, what would we talk about? What would we chat about if we had the opportunity to wander into this room now, even our little virtual room, because he was a wonderful storyteller. And what do you want to talk about? And I know he'd be so interested in you guys, because he was so, I mentioned before, he was the person who sort of opened up Ireland to Australian football. And I know it's pretty controversial over there, and for all the reasons that it should be, but he took those original tours over there with, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and when those games were played way back in the day. Well, that was his that was his vision, or partly his vision. Other people obviously were involved in it. So he'd be sitting here so keen to be talking to you guys to find out whatever happened, what happened for the next 30 years. You know? And I think about that because you should still be alive now. And so to sit down and to draw on those sorts of reflections, whether it's through my artwork or writing or conversations such as this, there's a wonderful creativity in that. And I hope I haven't taken it down too deep a place, but it's, for me, it's, you build over time a preparedness to go there. And when you do, you go to dip, but it's not easy.
I appreciate you sharing and talking about the relationships and connecting with people and connecting with us today. It's been like going to a fountain of knowledge. We've sort of been taking. So we've one last question for you. It's a question we ask everyone who comes on the show. It's, what does high performance mean to you, Cameron?
I think it is operating in an environment which is hard, like really hard, competing against people who are just as capable, if you know what I mean, and working just as hard, but working out a way of which this group can do it better than whoever we're competing against. We've found a way which is unique to us. In finding a way which is unique to us, that makes us really predictable to each other, but really difficult to play against. You know, very unpredictable to play against. So therefore, we're probably playing in a way which has never been. So I'm talking more about high performance in the context of teams, where each of the individuals have found a way that built connection. We're a mix of nerds and bloody mavericks. We're a mix of snarly old scarred veterans and blokes playing their second game. We're a mix of, private school kids and Indigenous kids from Central Australia. That's what high performance means. We've found a way to make this group fucking good.
It's interesting. We heard that phrase for the first time, find a way, off Mike Brown, a English rugby player, about 2 weeks ago. Yeah, in response to that question. And now you've touched on it and added flavour to it.
What by something back? I think it is about finding a way, isn't it? It's if we all said, okay, we're going to start something tomorrow, and if we're going to do something which is hard, the chances are we're going to come into conflict at some point, and we're going to go home, we're going to shake our heads, we're going to behave badly at different times. We're going to have to hold each other. We're going to have to pull each other up. I've got this sort of mantra of never blame the player, and because ultimately, as CEOs, as coaches, as performance people, we recruit them, we develop them, we put them out there, we do whatever we can. And yes, at different times they're going to disappoint us, but it's not their fault. It's and we assume that they're going to, if they make a mistake, they're going to learn and grow and develop from it. That's okay.
Cameron Schwab, thanks very much for coming on today. Everyone have a look at designCEO. I'm going to be looking at it a lot more personally and more to the game, what leaders can learn from football. Cameron, that's an unbelievable resource. Thanks for sharing that with the world. I sent it to my dad yesterday and he printed out all the pages on his printer to give to me on Friday.
Send me a text and I'll send you a couple of hard copies and then you can send one to your dad, a hard copy of it. It's downloadable on the website, designCEO.com.au, Australian websites, and it's got more to the game. And I'm actually doing the next edition now. But on my email list, I'm doing a thing at the moment. I'm up to number 5 or 6, which is, I worked out this year, it was 40 years since I started work. So it's 40 lessons from 40 years. And so I'm up to number 6 or 7. So that's just an email list which people can sign up for as well at designCEO.com.au.
Yeah, we'll share that as well on our newsletter and make sure everybody, because the value in it is huge. So appreciate that.
Thank you, Cameron.
It's lovely to meet you, and I really